I didn't make a scene. I didn't raise my voice. I just picked up my jacket, folded it over my arm, and walked out of that restaurant while 43 people watched me go. That was 8 months ago. My son-in-law still calls it the incident. My daughter calls it the night everything changed. My wife, my ex-wife now, hasn't called it anything at all because I stopped answering when she called. 51 times. That's how many times she called me that night. I know because I sat in my truck in the parking garage on 5th Street and watched my phone light up on the passenger seat every single time. I didn't turn it off. I didn't block her. I just watched it glow and go dark until it finally stopped. Then I drove home to a house that suddenly felt like it belonged to me again. Let me back up, because the story doesn't start at a birthday dinner. It starts the way most stories like this start. Slowly, quietly, in a way you almost convince yourself you're imagining. My wife and I had been married for 22 years. I was 61 when all of this happened. She was 58. We'd built a life together in the way people do when they're serious about it. Paycheck by paycheck, compromise by compromise, small sacrifice after small sacrifice, until one day you look up and realize you've made something real. I worked 31 years as a civil engineer, city infrastructure, bridges, drainage systems, the kind of work nobody notices until something goes wrong. Decent pension. We owned our house outright in a suburb outside Columbus. Nothing glamorous. 2 bedrooms we didn't need anymore after our daughter moved to Portland. A workshop in the garage I'd been meaning to properly organize since 2019. My wife had retired early from her job managing accounts for a mid-sized logistics company. She got into gardening. She got into watercolor painting. She got into a man named, and I will never forget the plainness of this name, Keith. I didn't know about Keith for a long time, or maybe I did know. The way you know something is wrong with a bridge before you've run any calculations. You feel it in the way it vibrates under load. Something's off. You just don't want to be right. The first thing I noticed was her phone. She'd always been casual about it, leaving it on the kitchen counter, face up, not thinking twice. Then one spring, that changed. It went face down. It went to the bathroom with her. It went on our vacations in a way it hadn't before, not just for photos, but for something else, something she was tending to. I told myself she'd gotten into social media. She'd mentioned something about a Facebook group for watercolor artists. I told myself that was it. The second thing I noticed was the mileage on her car. I know that sounds small, but I had a habit, an engineer's habit, of glancing at the odometer when I helped her with something, filled her tires with air, checked the oil. In March, she told me she'd driven to her sister's in Dayton and back. Her sister lives 40 miles away. Dayton and back is 80 miles, give or take. The odometer had gone up 160 since I last looked. I did the math in my head while I was standing there with the tire gauge in my hand. I put it back in the glove box and went inside and made us both a cup of coffee and didn't say a word. The third thing, and this is the one that made it impossible to keep pretending, was a hotel charge on our joint checking account. Not a big charge, $68, a Holiday Inn Express in a town called Marysville, which is 40 minutes from our house and 2 hours from anywhere either of us had any reason to be. I called the number on the back of our debit card, reported it as a possible fraudulent charge, and waited to see what she'd say when they investigated. She didn't say anything, because she didn't know I'd noticed. And when the bank credited us back the $68, I think she assumed it had just disappeared the way small things sometimes do. I let her assume that. What I actually did was open a separate checking account at a different bank. My mother-in-law turned 75 in October. Her name is Adeline, and I want to be clear about something before I tell you what she did. I always liked her. For 22 years I liked her. She was sharp and funny, and she made the best pecan pie I've ever eaten. And she told me once, maybe 5 years into our marriage, that she was glad her daughter had found someone solid. Solid. That's what she called me. I held on to that for a long time. Adeline's birthday party was planned for a Saturday evening at Brixton's, a private dining room in a steakhouse downtown that her youngest son had reserved. 43 people. 3 generations of family. I'd been to maybe a dozen family events on that side of the family over the years. Christenings, graduations, Christmas Eve dinners at someone's house, and I had always been welcome. Always greeted by name. Always offered the first slice. My wife told me about the dinner 6 weeks in advance. She told me what to wear, my navy blazer, the gray slacks, dress shoes, not loafers. She said it like she was helping me. I said fine. What I didn't tell her was that I'd already found out about Keith. Not guessed. Found out. I'd hired a retired police investigator, a man who now does private work out of an office near downtown, and within 3 weeks he'd given me a folder. Photographs, dates, locations. A coffee shop on Reed Street 3 or 4 times a week. A park where they walked. The Holiday Inn Express in Marysville. Not once but 4 times over the course of 5 months. The folder cost me $800. Worth every cent, but not because of what it showed me. Because of what it let me stop pretending. I read through it at the workshop in the garage. Door closed, space heater running at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. Then I put it in a locked fireproof box I keep on the top shelf behind the router jigs. Then I called my own attorney. Her name is Deb. She's been practicing family law in Franklin County for 24 years, and she doesn't waste your time. First consultation, she told me, document everything, keep all financial records, do not move out of the marital home, do not confront your spouse before we're ready. She said if I was patient, this would go much better for me than if I acted on emotion. I told her I was an engineer. I said I understood the value of load-bearing before you open anything to traffic. She laughed. Then she got to work. The night of the birthday dinner, I drove separately. My wife thought it was because I had to stop and pick up the card and gift I'd gotten for Adeline, a cashmere wrap in dove gray and a framed photograph of Adeline and her late husband at their 50th anniversary that I'd tracked down, had restored by a woman on Etsy who does archival photo work, and had matted in a frame I'd picked out myself. I'd spent $430 on that gift. $430 for a woman I've respected for over 2 decades. I walked into Brixton's carrying it in a handled bag, and I was greeted at the door by my brother-in-law, Adeline's youngest, who shook my hand and said it was good to see me. I was shown to a table near the back of the room. There were place cards in little brass holders, the kind of event with place cards. I found mine, table 3, between my wife's cousin and an uncle I'd met twice. I looked at the head of the table. There was a man sitting there I'd never seen before. He was maybe 55, wearing a sport coat that didn't quite fit at the shoulders, and he had the particular comfort of someone who believes he belongs wherever he currently is. My wife was standing next to him, adjusting his lapel, when I walked in. She looked up and saw me, and for exactly 2 seconds, something moved across her face that I can't fully describe. Not guilt, not panic, something more like recalculation. She came over and kissed me on the cheek. She said I looked nice. She said she was going to check on Adeline, and she walked away. I stood there with the gift bag in my hand. I put it on the gift table. I found my seat. I sat down and unfolded my napkin and accepted a glass of water from the server. And I was, I think, very calm. Adeline came in a few minutes later, and the room did what rooms do. Stood up, made noise, opened its arms. She was wearing a blue dress and pearl earrings, and she looked genuinely happy. I stood with everyone else. She made her way around the room, and when she got to me, she hugged me and said, "Thank you for coming, sweetheart." And I said, "Happy birthday, Adeline. 75 looks good on you." She smiled. She moved on. I watched her go to the head of the table and lean down and kiss Keith on the top of the head like he was her own son. I learned his last name from my wife's phone 3 months earlier. I'd looked him up. He was a divorced general contractor from Westerville. He had 2 adult kids and a boat he kept at a marina on Alum Creek Lake. His Facebook was mostly public. In one photo, he was holding a wally the size of my forearm and grinning like he'd won something. Now he was sitting at the head of a table at my mother-in-law's 75th birthday dinner, in the seat where, for more than 20 years, I had sat. I know because I checked the old photos on my wife's laptop. I'd done this months earlier, looking for something else, and stumbled across them, and in photo after photo of family dinners, holidays, Adeline's 65th, her 70th, there I was at the head of the table, carving something or raising a glass. The seat of the husband, the man of the family. That's what it had meant. And now it meant Keith, in a sport coat that didn't fit. I sat at table 3. I ate a dinner roll. I had a glass of Malbec. I talked to the cousin on my left about her new job in HR. I listened to the uncle on my right tell a story about a road trip he'd taken in 1987. I was, I think, good company. When Adeline opened the gifts, she got to mine and she unwrapped it and she held up the photograph and her hand went to her mouth. She looked at me across the room and mouthed, "Thank you." Then she set it aside and picked up the next gift. Keith gave her a spa gift card. The room oohed. There were toasts. Her oldest daughter went first, then the youngest son, then someone who'd been Adeline's neighbor for 30 years. Then my wife stood up. I'm going to tell you what she said almost exactly because I have played it back many times in the months since. She said, "Mom, you've always known what matters. You've always known who belongs at this table and who doesn't. Thank you for welcoming the people into your life who make us all better." She looked at Keith when she said, "Who make us all better." She did not look at me. I set down my wine glass. Quietly, I placed my napkin on the table. I picked up my jacket from the back of my chair, and I walked to the gift table, picked up the bag that held the cashmere wrap and the framed photograph, and I walked out. I didn't say a word to anyone. I didn't look at my wife. I didn't look at Adeline. I walked through the main restaurant and out the front door and into the October night, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed in the cold air. And then I walked to the parking garage. I sat in my truck. My phone started ringing at 7:42. It didn't stop until 9:18. 51 calls. I know because I counted them later, scrolling back through the missed calls log before I put the phone on the nightstand and went to sleep in my own bed in my own house for what I knew would be one of the last nights that house belonged to both of us. In the weeks after that night, I learned things about myself I hadn't expected. I learned that I'm quieter than I thought I was. Not cold. I've been called cold since, and it's not accurate, but quiet. When things become clear to me, I don't need to announce them. I don't need the argument. I don't need to watch someone's face while they try to explain what I already know. My wife came home that night at 11:30. I was in the workshop. She came to the door and knocked and I said, "Come in." And she came in and stood there in her party clothes and she said, "We need to talk about tonight." I said, "We will, not tonight." She said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm fine. I'd like to finish what I'm working on." She stood there for another moment and then she went inside. I don't know what she expected. Maybe a confrontation. Maybe tears. Maybe I was supposed to demand answers that night. Who is he? How long? How could you? The whole script of it. And maybe some part of her was even ready for that, had prepared for it, had her responses lined up. I didn't give her the script. I had a different one. 3 days later, I had another meeting with Deb. I brought the folder from the fireproof box. I brought 6 months of joint financial records I'd already pulled and organized. I brought a list of all the marital assets I was aware of, down to the retirement accounts, down to the equity in the house, down to the workshop equipment, which, I'll be honest, matters to me more than the equity. Deb said I was the most prepared client she'd had in a long time. I said I'd had months to think about it. She asked if I wanted to try mediation or go straight to filing. I said filing. She said okay. My wife was served on a Tuesday morning in November, 3 weeks after the birthday dinner. I was at the hardware store when it happened. I came home to find her sitting at the kitchen table, the papers in front of her, and she was very still. She said, "How long have you known?" I said, "A while." She said, "About Keith?" I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I didn't think you'd do this." And I thought about that. I thought about what she meant, whether she'd meant she didn't think I'd file, or she didn't think I'd find out, or she didn't think I was capable of moving quietly and deliberately through 6 months of preparation without her knowing, because for 22 years I'd been solid and solid. I suppose she had taken to mean stationary. I said, "I know." And I made us both a cup of coffee, because old habits are old habits, and we sat at that kitchen table for a while without talking, and then she went upstairs and I went to the workshop, and that was, more or less, the last ordinary evening we spent in that house. The divorce was final in March. The house sold in April. We split the equity. I got a fair settlement. Deb made sure of that, and I rented a 2-bedroom apartment on the north side of Columbus while I figured out what came next. I put the workshop equipment in storage, and I spent some mornings driving around looking at houses the way you look at possibilities when you're not in a hurry. I found one in late May. Ranch style, 1 story, a detached garage the previous owner had wired for power and insulated properly. I bought it with cash, or close enough to it, and spent the first weekend moving in my tools. My daughter flew out from Portland. She didn't ask me whose fault it was, or whether I was okay, or whether I was lonely. She brought her good cast iron skillet and made us dinner, and we sat on the back step of my new house, and she said, "I always liked your workshop." I said, "Me too." She said, "This garage is even better." I said, "That's what I thought." That was the best conversation I had in a long time. I don't spend much time being angry, not because I've forgiven everything. I think forgiveness is something you arrive at slowly, like a destination you can't rush. But because anger was never what this was about for me. What it was about was this. For a long time, I believed that if you showed up consistently, worked hard, treated people decently, held the weight without complaint, that was enough. That was the contract. And I held up my end of it. For 22 years, I held up my end. What I've learned, slowly, in the way I learn things, by turning them over and examining the structure, is that the contract only works if both people believe in it. You can't enforce it. You can't make someone honor it. All you can do, when you realize they aren't going to, is decide what you're going to do with that information. I decided quietly. I decided carefully. I didn't burn anything down. I just stopped carrying something that wasn't mine to carry anymore. Adeline sent me a card in February, a few weeks before the divorce was final. A handwritten note on plain stationery. It said she was sorry for how things had happened. It said I had always been kind to her. It said she hoped I would be all right. I wrote back. I thanked her. I meant it. She's still my daughter's grandmother. Families don't unknot themselves cleanly. I know that. I'm not interested in clean. I'm interested in honest. The framed photograph, the one from her 50th anniversary, I took it back the night I left. It was in the gift bag when I walked out. I still have it. Sometimes I think I should return it, and then I think, she knows where I live. She hasn't come for it. There's something people want to know when they hear a story like this. They want to know if I regret not confronting her sooner. If I wish I'd said something at that table. If I lie awake replaying the moment I walked out and wonder whether I should have made a scene. I don't. What I regret, and I mean this as honestly as I can, is the years I spent not looking directly at the thing I didn't want to see. Not the marriage, not the work I put into it, but the moments when the odometer didn't add up and I chose not to do the math. The evenings when she was somewhere else in her own head and I told myself she was just tired. The Tuesday night with the hotel charge when I put the tire gauge back in the glove box and went in and made coffee. I should have done the math earlier, not because it would have saved the marriage. I don't think anything would have, but because I deserved to know what I was living inside. You can't make good decisions in a situation you refuse to accurately measure. I'm 62 now. I have a house I like, and a garage I love, and a pension that's enough, and a daughter in Portland who calls me every Sunday. I take a walk in the morning before it gets too hot. I've been thinking about getting a dog, a real one, a medium-sized one that likes to ride in trucks. I'm not interested in a new love story. Maybe someday, but not right now. Right now, I'm interested in what it feels like to be in a room where everything is exactly what it appears to be, where the math adds up, where I don't have to pretend I didn't notice something because I'm not ready to deal with what noticing it will cost me. It turns out that room is quieter than I expected, but quiet, for me, has never been a problem. The 51 calls stopped at 9:18 on a Saturday night in October, and I slept better that night than I had in years. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing, really. I've been asked, more than once since all of this happened, whether I think I did the right thing, whether walking out of that dinner without a word was the right call, whether staying quiet for 6 months while I put everything in order was fair, whether a man who loved his wife for 22 years should have fought harder to save what they had. I don't think those are the right questions. Here's what I believe, and I believe it, the way I believe things about load-bearing structures. Not because someone told me, but because I've seen what happens when you ignore the math. Every action has a consequence proportional to the choice that caused it, not as punishment, not as some cosmic accounting, just as physics. You build on a weak foundation long enough, eventually something shifts. The only variable is when and how much it costs you when it does. My wife made her choices over a long stretch of time. Small ones at first, I imagine. The kind that feel inconsequential when you're making them. A coffee here, a drive there, a hotel $68 out of a joint account. Each one small enough to rationalize, but choices compound. They build a structure of their own, and that structure has weight, and eventually it has to be held up by something. In her case, it was held up by my silence and my willingness not to look directly at what was in front of me. That's on me too. I want to be honest about that. I didn't look for a long time because looking would have cost me something I wasn't ready to pay. That's not weakness exactly, it's human. But it meant I spent months, maybe years, carrying the weight of something I was pretending not to know. And that weight doesn't disappear just because you choose not to acknowledge it. It just moves somewhere quieter inside you and sits there. Adeline seated Keith at the head of her table and called it hospitality. My wife raised a glass and called it belonging. But what they actually did, in front of 43 people who'd watched me show up to that family for over 2 decades, was hand me a piece of information I could no longer choose to ignore. And that, strangely, was a kindness. Not the kind they intended, but the kind I needed. There's a version of that night where I make a scene, where I confront Keith at the table, or pull my wife into the hallway, or deliver some speech about respect and 22 years of showing up. I've thought about that version. I understand why people might have wanted it. There's something satisfying about the idea of a wronged man speaking his truth in the moment. But I'm 62 years old, and I've spent my career measuring things before I move them. You don't start dismantling a structure until you know what's holding it up and what you're going to put in its place. I had already done that work. The folder in the fireproof box, the meetings with Deb, the separate account, the months of quiet calculation. Walking out of that restaurant wasn't a reaction. It was a conclusion. The moral life, as far as I can tell, isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest, especially when honesty is expensive. It's about having the intelligence to see things as they are and the resolve to act on what you see rather than on what you wish were true. Those two things together, clear eyes and steady hands, are what got me through the last year. Not anger, not bitterness, just the willingness to finally do the math and trust the answer it gave me. I sleep well now. The house is quiet. The garage smells like sawdust and machine oil, and I know exactly where everything is. That's not nothing. At 62, after everything, that's nearly everything.